Should we? So we are live. People can hear us.
Yep, we've already got plenty of people.
Oh, great. Everyone's hearing us talking. This is like the beginning of the podcast that they edit to be sort of natural, and it's like mid-conversation.
We were just talking about generational doom. If anyone else wants to listen to like the pre-show chatter.
And buying
Thank you for
things.
coming in, everybody. I'm Erica from Green Apple Books on the Park. Tonight we have Lauren Oyler and Anna Wiener for the celebration of Lauren's debut novel, Fake Accounts. Just before we get started, I'm going to make a few announcements about some events coming up. Our first event of March will be March 2nd with Megan Wagner-Lloyd and Michelle Me Nutter, celebrating the launch of their latest children's graphic novel titled Allergic with Raina Telgemeier. And on March 4th, we will have Jamie Figueroa discussing her debut novel titled Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer with Marie Helene Bertino. Just as we go through the reading tonight, feel free to leave any questions and comments in the Q&A feature on Zoom, just at the bottom of your screens there. And we will get to your questions and comments at the end of the discussion. Anna Wiener writes about tech culture for The New Yorker. She also wrote a book, Uncanny Valley, detailing her time working for Silicon Valley startups. And Lauren Oyler is based in New York, but she spends a lot of time in Berlin. Her essays on books and culture have appeared in The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and The Guardian, among other publications. Fake Accounts is her debut novel. Enjoy the show, everyone.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to start by reading the beginning of Fake Accounts. Not for too long, don't worry. Consensus was the world was ending, or would begin to end soon, if not by exponential environmental catastrophe, then by some combination of nuclear war, the American two-party system, patriarchy, white supremacy, gentrification, globalization, data breaches, and social media. People looked sad on the subway, in the bars. Decisions were questioned, opinions rearranged. The same grave epiphany was dragged around everywhere. We were transitioning from an only retrospectively easy past to an inarguably more difficult future. We were, it could no longer be denied, unstoppably bad. Although the death of any hope for humanity was surely decades in the making, the result of many intersecting systems described forbiddingly well, it was only that short period between the election of a new president and his holding up a hand to swear to serve the people's interests that made clear what had happened, that we were too late. I didn't believe all of this necessarily, though as the news got worse and more bizarre, I wavered. I've always been drawn to pragmatism, just not exactly a natural at it. As my brain says, calm down, my heart says, also weirdly calmly. A paradoxical comfort can be found in drama. It was and still is my official position, if you were to ask me at a party or something, that the popular turn to fatalism could be attributed to self-aggrandizement and an ignorance of history, history being characterized by the population's quickness to declare apocalypse finally imminent despite its permanently delayed arrival. We don't want to die, but we also don't want to do anything challenging, such as what living requires. So the volubility with which certain doom was discussed made a tedious kind of sense. The end of the world would let us have our cake and eat it too. We would have no choice but to die, our potential conveniently unrealizable due to our collapse. Until such time, the idea that everything was totally pointless now was seductive, particularly as a mantra you could take advantage of when it suited you and abandon when life actually started to feel alarming. I myself was soon using it to indulge some of my naughtier impulses, by which I mean that in the first hours of a morning in early January, when the sky was still dark and the government still inevitably hurtling, I decided to snoop through my boyfriend's phone while he was asleep. I'd never really had the urge to go through another person's things before. After a few disappointing experiences with high school boyfriends' instant message histories, I learned that poking around the byproducts of other people's thoughts usually yielded the mundane, the predictable, and the unattractive. Even with men I respected intellectually, I never found myself caring enough to breach their trust. Before Felix, my boyfriends exuded the wholesome, loving, deep down reliability of hot dads on television shows, despite being, as far as I knew, not hot, nor dads, nor on television. Another way of putting this is that before Felix, I had good taste. But over the year and a half we'd been together, Felix had revealed himself to be completely unrevealing. insisting over and over as I baited and nagged and implored him to tell me his innermost hopes, fears, and childhood formed biases, that either there was nothing to tell, or conflictingly, that he'd told me everything already and it wasn't his fault if I didn't remember. It was humiliating and typical, and per the usual narrative, I assumed he was hiding something, probably other women. That's all.
Such a flex that you read it off the screen.
Well, I could read it. I like edited it, you know, whenever you read, you usually like make your last minute changes, and I like edited it on the screen, and now it's totally edited, and it's much easier to read when you don't have like a mark on it all over the place. And then you can like look in the camera and be scary.
Yeah, well, it feels very dramatic.
Yeah. I quite like it, and you can make the text really big, which is easier. Technology is not all bad.
So I'm not going to take that bait. So I thought maybe we could start with just like a kind of a big question. So for context, for people who are here, and also I should say thank you for coming, and thank you to Green Apple, best bookstore in San Francisco. I hope no other bookstores are watching. Sorry that I said that. They're all great. There are a lot of great bookstores in San Francisco, but I have a soft spot for Green Apple. And for context, Lauren and I have actually never met. We met 5 minutes ago on Zoom. We've been emailing a little bit today. And just like an hour before the event, you said something very tantalizing over email, and then appended it with like, for another time. But I feel that this is a good time. No time like the present. You had thoughts on the new rise of autofiction and its relationship to the internet. And I feel like that's actually a great launching point if you want to go there. What are your thoughts? What's the theory? What's been new on your mind on that front?
Yeah, sure. Well, for context, the novel, if you don't know, is about a woman who snoops through her boyfriend's phone, as you just heard, and instead of finding that he's cheating on her, she finds that he's an anonymous conspiracy theorist who has a popular Instagram account where he posts conspiracy theory memes. But the sort of general voice, and I think like a lot of the details that some reviewers have picked up on, and then I sort of intend for people to pick up on, are like from my life sort of, and it has led a lot of people to ask if this is autofiction, or to feel that they're insulting me by suggesting that the book is autofiction, but they can't help but say, notice that I talk about I use the narrator's Twitter avatar as my avatar and things like that. And before the event, Anna and I were talking about what we were talking about. I was talking about personal essays and how it's sort of odd when you know someone who's written a personal essay, or you might not know them personally, but you might be able to sort of glean a lot of facts about them from their social media presence that you observe probably over time. And then they write these personal essays that have sort of disputable ideas in them based on what you might know about them, right? And I think that this sort of relates to the question of autofiction, which I define as any novel that explicitly creates sort of confusion or blurs the line between the author and the character in the book, ideally the narrator or the protagonist, because you can, basically you can Google an author now, right? You can sort of find out quite a lot about them just by looking them up. And whenever I read a book, I'm always going to be Googling the author, even if they're dead, but particularly if they're alive, and sort of looking at their social media, looking at the past press they've done, like probably reading their Wikipedia. And this is definitely a horrifying thought for a lot of authors, probably myself included. But for me, who has sort of grown, I grew up posting things online, not thinking about the fact that those things would follow me on Google for the rest of my life. And I think that there's this sort of like tension between wanting to write a book where you can sort of use your life as you want, and sort of discard it when it's not really useful to the narrative or whatever, and the sense that everybody's watching you all the time, or not just your friends and loved ones who might be betrayed by your narrative, but like strangers who've been following you on the internet for 10 or 15 years might also feel betrayed by your narrative in some way. So I think that that's a super interesting question, and probably has something to do with why so many writers are turning to this form these days? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. I'm intrigued by what you're saying about the sort of like extra textual analysis that people do online, because this was something that people did with my book because I didn't name proper nouns in many cases, and it wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to send people to Google. And I'm curious if when you were writing your book, sort of being aware of that playfulness between yourself and this character and the performance of self and the performance in fiction that, you know, is inherent to fiction, you know, you're saying that you sort of like, this is kind of a nightmare for some writers, possibly yourself included. Like, how did you weave all of that in when you were writing? I mean, how did you think about it? Did you just not think about it? How present of a question was it for you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about it, and I also just thought about how it works on different levels, right? So I assume that most of my readers do not care about my tweets. I assume that there's a section of my readers who do care about my tweets, and that is personally torturous to me. It's something that I wish that I could sort of get over, right? Like, I wish I could not look and see when people are saying things about me as if I'm not in the room, as it were, right, but they are. So hopefully it works on different levels, right? So I can be like winking at the people who know me, and if you don't know me, it doesn't really matter, because because I'm using real details in some cases, it seems realistic anyway. So you don't have the sense of having to like make you know, I think that's also another sort of very basic appeal of working from your own life, because you have all the stuff available and you don't really have to worry about making things seem believable and not making them work in some way, because you know they work because it has happened to you. But yeah, I mean, when I reviewed your book for the Times, and I was Googling where you were, you know, because I'm not super familiar with Silicon Valley. So I was Googling all the more, not, you know, you refer to Google as something that's very obviously Google, but the companies that you worked at, I was like looking them up so that I could figure out what they were. And I think in the same way that I am not only writing for my Twitter followers, I am also not only right, you know, there's going to be a group of people who's going to be looking you up, basically. And it's not everyone, but it's only growing, basically.
No, simpler times when you could just look at the author photo and read the acknowledgements and feel like you got the footnotes to.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about the Elena Ferrante conversation, right? So it was outed in Italy and then sort of re-outed in the United States, and many people knew who she was, and then all these people responded to her outing as kind of outrage, and I, you know, understand why you would want to know who she is, right? Like, do I think it's right? That's another question. But I think to pretend like you wouldn't want to know that, even if, you know, she's just some Italian person that you've never heard of, is like denying something that's really true about people.
I feel like we could definitely take a detour into that conversation. So I'm going to pull a power move and just swerve
yeah.
and focus on your book. But I was interested in, I don't think it's giving, I think you might have said this at the beginning when you were giving sort of a summary. The narrator of fake accounts discovers that her boyfriend is secretly a conspiracy theorist, or runs, it's never really clear if he himself believes in the conspiracies that he is peddling, but he runs this popular account that trades in conspiracy memes. And I was curious whether, I mean, there's something about Twitter that like seems to lend itself to a conspiratorial tone. And this is, but completely unrelated to conspiracies themselves. It's just kind of like connecting the dots. I think this is also because people are online and they're Googling, you know, pieces of information or people. And it's sometimes really interesting to me to stumble across someone making a sort of conspiratorial argument about something that is very straightforward. Right. But I think it's like, it's just this something about the form. And I'm curious if there was something about, and like, forgive the outrageous pretension of this, what I'm about to say, but like
Okay.
Twitter as like a text or as a literature that was appealing to you as a novelist, or that felt rich to you?
Yeah, I think that probably like my initial spark, or however you want to phrase it, for the book was very basically like watching people interact with each other, and watching how, noticing how I interact with people online, most of whom I don't know and will never meet, or have met, one or two times. And they would just do things that, you know, on one hand, yes, you would probably never do this in real life. You would probably never say to some random person that you've never met, like a journalist that you're competitive with, like, if I were you, I would kill myself. But people do this online all the time, and they do it in these sort of like, they want to be found out, but they also, don't want to face the consequences of being found out. So I'm, subtweeting is we could talk about it all day. Even though the psychology is very basic, which is that they want to be able to express their mean thoughts without having expressed their mean thoughts and gotten in trouble for it. But yeah, I mean, I was just watching all this stuff, and it became sort of unbelievable that people would do all this in public, in full view of their employers, their friends, their people that they would potentially go out with, right? Like they act this way and then they expect to get dates. It's very weird. And I'm also not innocent of the bad, cruel, like pathetic tweeting behavior, certainly. But I think that, like, first of all, the sort of disbelief that you feel looking at Twitter is something that relates to conspiracy theories as well, because there's this sort of like, can this person possibly believe this, and how can it possibly be true that what is being said right now is valid in some way? And it can very easily like make you spin out and sort of like look for clues. And there's this sense of like the knowledge is there, it's on the computer, all you have to do is like know how to search for it, right? And that you can find like any number of things online, like either through people's old social media or through Google or whatever, like I'm very I'm not innocent of that at all. And I think there's that element. And then there's also an element that I notice of sort of close reading. So like you can read you have to really pay attention to people's tone, and you pay attention to their tone over time, and you can sort of assess what's going on in their life, or if they're in a bad mood, or if they're, if they're not liking your tweets anymore because they have decided they don't like you for some reason, or if they're just not liking your tweets anymore because something bad has happened to them and they're not on Twitter or whatever, so there is an element of like close reading or too close reading, or not, it's not just reading for content, basically. Does that answer your question? We didn't really talk about Twitter as literature, but I think too, like character is probably the number one like literary element that I see on Twitter. And then I use to like observe people, and particularly like if people are performing, you can still read them. You just have to incorporate that knowledge of the performance into your analysis, which can feel quite productive, even if it's actually not.
Well, I think that's the thing that I find most interesting about Twitter is it's like that this is the persona that you've chosen, or that's a person has chosen. And a lot of people really commit to the bit, so to speak. And it's always strange when they break character and you sort of know the tone. I mean, influencers do this too on Instagram all the time, but that always feels a little bit more packaged in some way. I think what you're articulating is like kind of getting to my question of like Twitter as a literature, which is I'm already regretting saying, but
No, it's true.
It has its conventions, it has its and I think it has its sort of like social behavioral conventions too, not just linguistic ones. And a lot of those are dictated by the software itself, right? Like the retweet, the quote retweet, the subtweet. And it makes me wonder whether we will see, like, will there be a great novel about Clubhouse? Like that's such a different environment in which people are speaking to each other ostensibly in a casual manner, but people speak to each other differently within different technologies or types of rooms or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been on Clubhouse yet, so I don't know, but it depends on how, right? Will there be like a TikTok novel? There have been Instagram novels. Definitely. I think, yes, I think first of all, this sort of practical thing about Twitter is that writers like to be on, like writers are on it, right? So they want to, there's much, you want to work with language. I'm not good at talking, as you can tell. I don't want to be on Clubhouse because I'm not as articulate when I'm speaking as I am when I'm writing. So, and like whatever, I'm not good at taking pictures, so I'm not on Instagram either. But the thing about Instagram that was interesting to me, and why Felix, the boyfriend character, has his conspiracy theory meme account on Instagram and not anywhere else, was that you can't link. It's really hard to link, particularly at the beginning of 2017. It's really hard to link from Instagram. So there's no way for people to like check the veracity of whatever you're saying there, and you can just sort of like blab on. So it makes a lot of sense for it to be on that platform rather than on Twitter, where you can like very easily move from one account to another and click on a link and go back to Twitter. So I agree with what you're saying, but the Clubhouse novel seems like I'll read it immediately. Maybe you have to write it.
If I had to write it, I'd have to hang out on Clubhouse, and I don't think I have the temperament.
Yeah, but the terrible thing is that when it becomes work, you can just justify hanging out on it also.
That's true. That's fair. I mean, I think Zoom is your medium because of the ambiance in the room right now. I just really feel like I'm on a lovely daytime talk show.
That's great. I mean, this is almost the full extent of the apartment, so it really creates like a false impression.
It's nice. I mean, I think just hearing like I'm just riffing, but you and I have the same problem, I think, conversationally, which is that we're writers. But like the idea of the Clubhouse novel sort of reminds me of the Susan Sontag story, The Way We Live Now, which is all told through conversation, told through people like whispering on the telephone I think at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, trying to sort of put together the story of what's happening to their friend. And it's almost like gossip is the mode of the story, or not gossip exactly, but intimate conversations between people who are close. And I do wonder if like the sort of extra layer of performance, like, does that make for good literature, or is it already so like you kind of have to get meta about it because it's so directed, but by the participants. I'm curious, just to go back to what you were saying about the subtweet as a form. I feel like maybe I'm like showing my hand here. I feel like there's no greater subtweet than a book. Like my book is full of subtweets, and I kind of think your book is also full of subtweets.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that whenever anyone does something stupid online, I'm like, do you think that nobody's watching you particularly, and I'm not going to put it in my book? Like, I'm going to put it in my book. There's no reason. I have no loyalty to you. You're not my friend. And then this like relates, I think, to what you're saying about the Sontag story, except opposite, which is that my book is full of like layers of interactions with people that the narrator is not close to, right? So she's constantly interacting with people on various levels, like even her close friends are sort of distant from her in one way or another, if it's because of sort of like received ideas they have about how she should be processing something bad that happens to her, or because she is like purposefully distancing herself from them so that she doesn't have to sort of face up to her weird feelings that she has about what happens in the book. So the way that gossip works online is super interesting, because it's like all these people who don't know each other, and I just know like horrible things about people that I will never meet, but that I would recognize on the street immediately. Do you know what I mean? And it's this like very weird, and I'm sure that this is true even if you don't work in the media. I think you could probably, you could say that this is definitely more true of people who work in the media, but I think this is true of all sorts of industries where people are online all the time, right? Like you are interacting with, or subcultures, right? Like it doesn't have to be work related. It's like water cooler gossip times 100. And there's really, that old thing that everybody says about how it doesn't really matter because there are no consequences because you're online, you're not in person. It's true.
Well, I mean, this sort of ties into a question that I had about humor, because the book is very funny, and I feel we haven't like highlighted that enough. And I feel like it's a specific kind of humor that is immediately recognizable to me as someone who is around your age, although we established significantly older somewhat.
Significantly older. You're really wrong.
The internet has micro generations. I think we probably float in similar professional and social circles. And some of the humor I would describe as like, it's a little mean. It is pointed, can be a little caustic. I feel like it is the kind of humor that has a certain currency on social media. But if you actually, met the person in real life, they are jokes that no one would ever make to your face. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they are, I don't know, maybe it's a sort of like party best friend where you meet someone at a party and you don't know anyone else, and like that, that's your night. But I guess I'm curious how you thought about writing humor about the internet. And I guess I'm just going to bundle another thing in here because I guess we're going to have plenty of time, but
sure. I'm taking a note so that I remember the first one.
I'm sorry. I mean, it's really dreadful that writers do live conversations, because I feel like we should have just published our emails from today.
Yes. But probably not.
But yeah, but where was I going with that? Oh, I guess comparing that to, so there's a scene in the book, I don't think I'm giving anything away here, mm-hmm. that I thought was really interesting and I enjoyed at the Women's March, mm-hmm. and in Washington, D.C. And I wondered, that was an event, I wasn't there, but my impression of it, I went to the one in San Francisco. So earnest, so sincere. There were people with genuine rage and anger and significantly, I don't know, like serious political demands. And I find that is somehow a harder environment to translate than a digital environment where everyone is being self-protective. Mm-hmm. And I guess they're comparable because they're both sort of, they're group scenes. Mm-hmm. It's an ongoing loud conversation between, where a lot of strangers are in the same place, and there's sort of a cacophony, and one is like a cacophony of sincerity and the other is a cacophony of posturing, and in certain cases, delight, joy, anger, cruelty, whatever is happening on any given moment in Twitter. And I'm curious, as someone who you had that sort of great set piece and then the set piece of the internet, mm-hmm. did you approach writing them differently? How did you think about them? How do you think about sincerity and humor? And if you want to pull a thread from that tangle. No,
I mean, I think that I see that the parallel between the Women's March thing and social media is, at least when I was there, I went to the one in DC, and what was striking to me at the time was how big this is really a dumb comment, but it was really big. And you're really like aware of like iterations of people going on forever. And then you look at your phone and you realize the iterations of people are not just in DC, but in New York and California and all around the world. In Antarctica, there's people on a boat, like doing a women's march. And you just like can easily access, if you allow yourself to think about it for like one extra second, how big and like encompassing and not uniform it couldn't possibly be uniform, right? When you have this like huge crowd. And I think that the same thing is true of social media, which is that it seems very homogenous and it seems like a cacophony of like, you can think about it as one thing, but actually if you just like turn the corner, you see that it's very big. And Alex Jones is right there, or John Kerry is right there, right? And like when I was there, I was like, well, I know that it can't possibly be that everybody feels just totally earnest about this, or everybody feels the same way about this, right? Like a lot of people were there, I think, for very ambivalent reasons. I did see Alex Jones there. He was obviously there for not ambivalent reasons. And I think what the narrator tries to do, and also what I try to do is like resist this like sense of a real consensus. Like she's very much aware of the illusion of a consensus, but it's not. Once you sort of get rid of that, you're like, okay, well, what do I do now? And that I think is the big problem with the book, and the thing that makes her sort of like feel alienated and also a little bit crazy. In terms of humor, I mean, I think of it as, I try to think of the book as someone who was like gossiping to you and like talking to you directly, but talking only to you. And it's a sort of, like you say, like a party thing, which it is similar. You know, I don't think that internet humor exists in a vacuum. I don't think that it's only happening online, right? Like I think that basically everything that happens online has an analog, not to, you know, no pun intended, has an analog in the offline world. And to say that humor is like totally ironic, I think is to like deny. I don't know. I think you can say that it comes from the internet, or that it's similar to like certain kinds of whatever, like people on the internet. But also I think you can, not to flatter myself, but I think that you can say it's similar to Dorothy Parker, who's like quite biting and mean. Like I think that you can say, I'm just reading a lot of Thomas Bernhard. I think that you can say he's like quite mean. There are a lot of mean people throughout history. and the point is not that like I'm not on the internet. It's that the people who are on the internet are just like people, right? Like, and they're just in a new context, and you're encouraged to read things through that context, but it's not always the best way to read things, because if you depend too much on it as a metaphor, I think that you will get burned, as you know, as I think the narrator eventually does get burned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think also that it's a humor that is a relief when it articulates something that that is ambient but unsaid.
Yeah,
that's
and
part of the joy of social media, I think.
And I think that like it's been interesting to read my reviews, because everyone's like, irony, the primary mode of social media, and I'm like, that is not my experience of social media. I'm sorry that you feel oppressed by Chapo Trap House, but like most of the people that I see like online are like fake earnest, have this like grotesque like lack of levity about them, right? That's evil. It's, you know, there's like a cruelty, or like a very earnest sort of desperation to be heard through emphasizing how important whatever you're saying is. And I see, like you say, like I see that humor as like a relief. And but what the reviews make clear to me is that everybody feels very embattled online, and that they are in the minority and not in the majority. So what do we do? I don't know.
The reviews are all written by literary critics, presumably. So unless you're reading the Goodreads reviews, which we have a great question. I'm just gonna, there's a Q&A, I don't know if you can see it, but someone asked, are there other aspects of the ecosystems and machinery of the internet that you would especially like to see further explored in literature? And I think that's a big question that maybe we should revisit during the Q&A, but I just want to say, yes, Goodreads reviews and Yelp reviews. These are like rich texts waiting to be mined, just like everyone's expectations, thwarted expectations, you know, their desires. It's really all laid bare in the review.
Yeah. And I think too, like the thing that's interesting to me, like if I were going to write a novel about a Goodreads reviewer, hypothetically, would be like, why? What is the motivation? Why are they doing this all the time? Why are they obsessed with Goodreads? Like, why do they have this account? Like, why are they doing this? Do they, like, how much do they buy into the fiction that their take matters? And like, actually, how much does their take matter? Because something that I still don't understand, even though I've written this book and people have been like, oh yeah, you need to like email, I don't know, whenever you write a book, for people in the audience, your publisher will be like, you need to email all your friends and tell them to leave reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, because it's more important than anything that people say on social media, regardless of how powerful they are on Twitter or whatever. So it's very depressing. But the like how where does the Goodreads reviewer's sense of vital importance like intersect with their actual importance, and like does it actually have sway for publishers? Is something that's very interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Goodreads reviewer does matter, but not to the author, or shouldn't matter to the author, which is like, I didn't do an MFA program and I haven't taken workshops since I was in my early 20s, but I think it was a high school teacher once said, you have to choose your readers really carefully.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that's definitely true of a 16-year-old who's like writing short stories about experiences they haven't had. But I think even when you've published a book, like you have to choose whose feedback you listen to very carefully, because otherwise it can be you can just feel so trapped so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in college, I was in a writing class and we paired up each time we wrote something. And one time I paired up with someone and someone had given me like all these comments, just like horrific comments. And then I went into my professor's office and she was like, don't listen to any of those. And it was very instructive. And I remember it still because I think I find it quite maybe easier than some people to just like not listen to something that's not useful. But then you can get into the opposite problem of like not listening to anyone when maybe there's a good criticism out there that you don't want to hear, which is another behavior that you can really it's very easy to watch online. You can watch people do that. You can watch people do that all day. But yeah, I think something that I think about when I'm writing criticism is like not who is the book for, but how do you like make it clear that like someone who will like this, that you think it's good, to someone who will appreciate it, and like tell other people to sort of stay away. I don't know. I feel sort of bad because I think probably some people came to my book because it was advertised as like a woman finds her boyfriend is a conspiracy theorist, and then they think it's going to be about conspiracy theories, and it turns out it's about someone who's like deeply not interested in conspiracy theories, no matter how hard she tries to look and figure out more about her boyfriend. She's just interested in her boyfriend and herself mainly.
Boyfriends are the true conspiracy theory, I think.
Yeah.
Is the takeaway. This is like a real pivot, as I say, but I have these sticky notes and they say things like music, Yale, but they also say things. I just think you've said in interviews that you don't really listen to music, which I think is like fascinating, but we don't have to talk. But if you want to.
Well, I mean, I say that it's not like literally true. I listen to music all the time, but I don't pay attention to it, and I cannot like devote the time and energy that is required, I think, to like listen to consistently good and varied music. I love when someone else is DJing and they're critically a good DJ, right? Like I'm very much like able to recognize bad music. I just can't be bothered. I'm bad because I find Spotify very useful.
Above on the sticky note that says music, above it says Berlin, and I'm curious.
Oh yeah.
So a significant portion of the book takes place in Berlin, and I'm curious whether you are interested in like the literature of the expat in Berlin, if that sort of loomed over you at all while you were writing. How aware you were of that genre, because it's actually one that I'm personally not terribly familiar with, but I'm sort of ambiently aware that it exists. And I assume that you've probably done like quite a bit of research into it. So I was just curious what that is.
I mean, I don't know, and I would love if somebody has a recommendation for me to prove me wrong, but I don't know of like a recent novel that really gets at the sort of social dynamics of contemporary, maybe last 10 or so years of expat Berlin, which is really what I was interested in. Like, I very much am not like trying to say this is what Berlin's like, right? I'm trying to say like, when you move to Berlin and you become involved in English speaking activities, this is what you're going to find unless you get in a German class post haste. And so something, I mean, I was nervous to write about it because I think that lots of expats are territorial, and there's this whole sort of like constant debate about like who's real, and like you don't really speak German, you don't really live in Berlin, you're a tourist, and obviously that dovetails very nicely with the themes of the book, so it made a lot of sense to put it there. And there's sort of people like going to Berlin and using it in some way or another because it's really cheap and fun, and you can get a visa pretty easily. But in terms of like expat literature, yeah, I mean, I like it. I think in general, European expat literature is great. When you move to Berlin, they like give you a stocking with Christopher Isherwood in it, so you have to read the Berlin stories, which are, I mean, he's great, so it's fine. But more recent stuff, it's much more of like a legend than a sort of reality. But the reality I wanted to get at was like, it can be quite garish at times. It's not this like European fantasy that everybody, you know, has. It does have sort of many idyllic moments, but there's a lot of like crappy tourism going on around you, and you have to like make an effort, I think, to make it work. But yes, so the narrator, I don't know, she initially, her first introduction into Berlin is she's on like a horrible pub crawl, which is where she meets Felix, her boyfriend, and the pub crawl is in all these bars that are basically fake bars. Like they only open for the pub crawl. They don't actually exist to serve people who live in Berlin. And then they end up at this club called Matrix, which is real. That is also like not a real Berlin club, but it's sort of everything is advertised as like Berlin nightlife, but it's not, you know, it's not the actual Berlin nightlife that if you were there, even as a tourist with cool people instead of uncool people, you would be going to. And the narrator is sort of introduced to it by Felix, and he also has this very superficial understanding of the city and has a very superficial relationship to it. And then as she like learns more about it, she realizes that he like can't pronounce the name of his neighborhood, Friedrichshain. He doesn't, you know, go to any like bars where there are German people. Like he doesn't speak any German. He doesn't like, they don't do anything. And so when she eventually moves to Berlin, she feels like very competitive with him, and she wants to like beat him at being in Germany, rather than, you know, learn about German culture and history and have a sort of what you often see in books that are set in Berlin, where you have this sort of like wistful historical period where you're like walking through the graveyards and like learning about German authors that you Googled on Wikipedia, you looked up on Wikipedia.
I'm not familiar with the genre, but I fully believe you and feel no need to pursue it further.
Yeah, I mean, there's always like a research section of a Berlin novel, right? Where you're like, here's the part of Berlin history that I researched. And I think what's interesting about the city is that it's very like aggressively historical. Like it's not like low key at all. Like they've got like Berlin Wall. I mean, my favorite thing is in the book, there's a street where there's remnants of the Berlin Wall, and there's like holes in the Berlin Wall, and across from it is a Trabi Safari. So a Trabi is like an old GDR car, and you can rent the Trabi and drive down this tourist street, and you can look through the Berlin Wall. There's a hole in the Berlin Wall. You look through it, and there's the like an exhibit at the old SS headquarters, and it's just this like really obvious like metaphor that is like so literal. And I think that Berlin has this like relationship to history too, where you're like, come here for like history in the now, you know. But obviously there's actually much more to it if you think about it at all.
Well, I think that was one of the things that
sorry, nobody asked me about Berlin, so I'm like very excited to talk about it.
Well, I was excited to read about it because I've been to Berlin 3 times for maybe 10 days each, and I think it's a fascinating city. But I feel I like have felt the weight of history walking through Berlin, and I think part of that has to do with my family history, and also part of it has to do with what you're describing, which is just like at every turn, you know, there's some memorial, or there's a museum, or there's something really tacky. And I was interested in what seemed to be a decision on your part to kind of back off from that layer of Berlin, where like I think you mentioned the topography of terrors, maybe.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel heavy-handed. And I think that the last thing that I read about Berlin that really captured what I thought Berlin was as someone who'd visited, like spent no time there, is Gideon Lewis Krauss's memoir, A Sense of Direction. And he has, I don't, have you read that?
Yeah, but a long time ago. So
Yeah. The scenes in Berlin I think are fantastic. But I don't know why I should know. I don't know, but they seem to capture something that spoke to me. I don't know. But especially the sort of like currency that I'm like, do I want to go here? I can't capture the humor in which he writes about this, but the way of saying that you're Jewish can kind of like be a currency in a certain way socially. Like,
yeah, I mean,
um,
the Germans have lots of different ways of dealing with it, but yes, they will. I mean, now I'm friends with this woman, Laurel Kretschvila, who helps run Shakespeare and Sons, which is a bookstore, and she brought bagels, and so there's now like a real like Jewish contingent who live there. But I think when I lived there, which was like 2012 to 2014, it was really just like getting started, and there would be like an Israeli restaurant opening, and then you would talk to people who run the restaurant, and they would be like, yeah, my grandma is like devastated that I would move here, and it's very it sucks, and they would be harassed and stuff, which I think is still true. I don't have tons of access to that, but it's interesting. I think it's interesting, and I can see why you would want to like be there and like see what it's like. Do you know what I mean? If you were a young person now.
yeah, for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I mentioned that part of Gideon's book. It's funny, like he's describing that
Yeah.
he's like, suddenly I'm very interesting, but like nature of looking Jewish. But I guess it's interesting to hear you talk about that sort of layer of Berlin, the like packaged historical Berlin, because there's also like something when I was reading the sections of Berlin and thinking about the sort of alienation that one feels in a country where you don't quite speak the language, even if you're trying to learn it, and how people treat you differently, and the pub crawl being this like sort of experience of a place rather than like an actual engagement with a place. But it's in the same way that in San Francisco, if you walk around Haight-Ashbury, there's like all of this sort of summer of love, like iconography, like murals, and there's a Thai restaurant called like Hippie Thai that opened in 2017, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And how people engage with that with sincerity, that it means something to them. And I don't quite know what, like this tie to history, but it's in some ways as real as like showing up in Berlin and going to visit a home where your family member once lived, something like that. Do you know what I mean? Like you can't really rank them in any way, because it's just people's way of moving through the world. This is sort of related to my next and I think last question, because we have a bunch in the Q&A, and I want to encourage people to ask questions if you have them. But we were talking over email about this idea. I think you called it like the cleanness in literature, and you've written a little bit about this with respect to morality and sort of like the quality of goodness that people seek out in literature, which is so fascinating. Because fictional characters, even in nonfiction, are fictional characters. But I'm curious if you were interested in talking a little bit about, you said something about applying like that current contemporary critical lens to older works of fiction and how it influenced, or I don't know, not really how it influenced, but just reading with that in mind. And I was wondering if you would indulge me and expand on that a little bit, because I think it's really interesting, and I'm curious like what you see when you and what you're reading, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I started reading like when I started reading quote unquote old books, whatever. I mostly read books from the 20th century. When I started reading them like after I had done my copy editorial novel, I started reading them and like paying attention to like weird mistakes or like things that I would change, or like repeated words or sort of like infelicities in whatever way. Or like things that I thought that could be edited, because I was vaguely panicked for like a day about having my galley, my sort of pre-galley, which goes out in 6 months before the book actually comes out, and it's not the final version of the book. So I was like panicked because I had made like 250 changes from the galley to the final book, and they're all like small, right? But I was like, oh no, like all the sort of reviewers are reading this version, and this is the version that I read, or whatever. And then I started like reading old books, like whenever I would read one, and I would just be like, oh, there's all sorts of like stuff that we would call crap in here that I would never notice if I weren't looking at it, and stuff that would be sort of the authors would be encouraged to edit it out or to trim it down or to like make this a 75,000 word like nice little book that seems very like polished. And I think that polish is something, both structurally and like morally, people really want from books now, or they think they want. I don't know. Like we were talking about the Golden Notebook, but I think really, I'm just looking at my bookshelves, like any book that was published before the real sort of like MFA era of like 19, I don't know, like arbitrarily we can say like 2000 or something, and all of the books have like weird stuff in them that you would edit out or whatever, but actually you don't care when you're reading it now because you have a sort of more reasonable perspective on the book. And I think that the literature now, the way that literature is now, and I think we probably agree on this a little bit, is like really clean and like really polished, and really like the person, if they don't have the writer, if they don't have a real perspective on humanity and on life and on politics or whatever, they're like, at least I can make this book perfect, and every section can be evenly spaced, and every sentence can be sort of like balanced with every other sentence, and I can have this sort of appearance of perfection. And there's this like weird striving for a perfect book that I think is very, is very weird. I think people talk about perfect books in like an unhealthy way sometimes. I'm like, what are you talking about? Of course no book is perfect. And similarly, I think in book criticism, people talk about like the flaws, and there's this like weird thing that I hope that I don't really, when I like a book, I don't like talk about its flaws, because I'm like, I only have 1,500 words or 2,000 words or whatever. Like, I'm not going to waste space on being like, of course the book has flaws, because of course the book has flaws. It's not interesting if it's ultimately a book that I think is good or interesting or valuable in some way. But now that I'm like reading all my reviews, I'm like, oh, there's like a real sense that you should be talking about the flaws in order to like report about them. And I think that there's this like professionalized attitude towards books, both people who are writing them and people who are reviewing them, that it does I think it's depressing, right? Like I just don't like them. I don't like the vibes. I don't like the vibes are really bad.
I think like something that I have noticed is that people, and something I have noticed reading reviews of my own, but
yeah, exactly.
people really want a thesis, and I think that's interesting. I mean, I understand that impulse, and I don't know if that's always been the case. People want clarity on a political argument in a book, and and I guess I wonder, like, what's behind that desire, and for that desire on the part of the reviewer or the reader for an argument, for a worldview that's coherent and sort of and good and airtight. And I don't have an answer for it, but I sympathize with it because I think that ambivalence can be really unsettling, or like contradiction can be really unsettling. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Do you have a theory about that, about what drives that impulse or that desire?
I mean, I have like a very cynical theory, which is that I also don't know that it's new, right? Like, I'm sure there have always been people who want this and who say like, this novel or this memoir is not strident enough in its political commitments. But there's like a point that, there's a point at which you have to say like, what is the function of the novel? What is the function of the memoir? What is the function of the work of art? And is it's not to educate, right? Like, it's just not. So and also you can't hold all novels, all memoirs, all works of art to the same the same standards, right? Like it depends on what the aim of the author is, and the context in which it's produced, and the context in which it's published, and all this stuff. Like, I mean, I don't know. What is depressing to me, and this maybe circles back to this autofiction question at the very beginning, is that when the people who are making these sort of like really simplistic moral political demands are people that I know for a fact have had like the kind of education that like allow them to expect more from art, right? So like there's this sort of paternalistic idea like, oh, I don't need this moral lesson, but other readers who are vulnerable and fragile out there need a very simple, dumb book because they're stupid. I am the person who says that they need it, right? Like it doesn't seem to me to be like about the critic who's making these demands very often. It seems to be about some like imagined dumb audience that needs this kind of thing. And I think that maybe explains it. I don't know. And a related idea is probably that they think that that's what they're supposed to do and that that's the right answer. And it's harder to sort of think about the book's relationship to the world and to life and to the author in a non categorical way.
Interesting. I mean, I interesting.
I don't know.
I think I do want to follow up on that, but I want to be mindful of people's questions because we have a lot of them, and I said ask them, and then I talked more myself, and I'm sorry. This is an interesting one about Berlin.
Okay.
Have you ever been to Berghain, and what do you think about places like Berghain? Berghain is a club, which aren't very online, i.e. people can't take photos. There are not a lot of reference or opportunities for intertext, and yet they're still very online concepts.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have been to Berghain a few times. There was, interestingly, a rumor on Reddit maybe a year ago that I had never been to Berghain and that I refused to learn German. Neither of which is
true. Gossiping about you on Reddit?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, you don't like music, so what would you do at Berghain?
Well, I like that, but that's a DJ. Someone's in control of the music. I really like house music. But I guess it's Panorama Bar is the house music. So Berghain, if you don't know, very famous club, like arguably the best club in the world. A very incredible space. It used to be in a power plant in Berlin, Friedrichshain. And there's a lower floor that has hardcore techno that's kind of scary, and then there's the upstairs that is Panorama Bar that has like house music. And then when you're there and the sun comes up, it comes up through the windows and everybody cheers and it's really fun.
But you can't document it? That's part of the...
Yeah, theoretically, I think you get kicked out if you were caught taking pictures. Obviously, it's not, you can sneak and take a picture, but if you're caught taking pictures, they'll probably take your phone and maybe you have to get it at the end. I think now they put a sticker on your phone camera. So it's sort of like the honor system, but I imagine it's the same as if you're like caught doing drugs openly, which is that they'll take the drugs and then maybe kick you out if you're like a flagrant violator. I don't know. But yeah, there's this whole like online community about Berghain where people are like constantly blogging. And this is not really in my book. My book has about stuff about blogs about how to get your visa, but it's very similar because there are tons of blogs about how to get into Berghain. And like the blogs are always like, you have to wear these kinds of outfits, you have to wear this kind of clothes and be cool, and you have to speak German or like not talk, because if you seem like a tourist, you're not going to get in, and all this stuff. But what is the meat of the question? What do I think about it? Like, do I think that it's... One worries about it, because the line is very long. The line is really long. And I think maybe last year or the year before they started doing a thing. It used to be that you could go early and get a stamp and then come back at like 3 a.m. when it's like really fun and you can skip the line. But now I think you have to pay extra to skip the line if you come back. So that is a sort of like, I think they're trying to resist the like internet onslaught of like cool people just ruining it. will they succeed? I don't know. Also, what's clubbing going to be like after this? Hopefully it's going to be like very fun, but maybe not. I don't know. Have you been to Berghain?
I have. Yeah. I mean, I think that what was interesting to me about that question is this idea of like of the in-person space with an online identity that is like not generated in the moment. And I'm thinking about, I have some friends who have a restaurant in Brooklyn that is like designed in a way, whether or not it's intentional, I don't know, but it's like hostile to phone photography. Like the lighting's just not good enough. And so you don't really see people taking photos of their phone that often, but again, you know, the online presence is still important for marketing and stuff like that. So anyway, lots of
yeah, I mean, Berghain doesn't have a marketing problem, so they don't really need to like advertise at the parties or whatever, because everyone's going to be there all the
time. There's a question about conspiracy theories, online conspiracy theories, if that's a world that you immerse yourself in to get a grasp of how it looks just from a first person perspective. Was that, if so, can you talk about what that experience was like?
Yeah, I mean, I did it a bit, but I wrote most of the book like before QAnon had even ever posted. So it takes place entirely before QAnon existed. It ends in like June 2017, and QAnon posted their first thing in October of 2017. So it was really this like niche, quirky thing for most of the time that I was doing it. And as time went on, like it got increasingly volatile and important. But so yes and no, but I wanted to do it from the perspective of like the narrator is someone who fundamentally cannot access the mindset, and she believes that Felix also doesn't buy it and is a sort of like is faking it in order to like get attention or to like do an experiment or whatever. So it didn't like help to like get that into it, because it needed to be someone. The book is about people who like see its power as like a marketing or like a sort of like sexy like idea, but who don't believe in it, if that makes sense. And something happens in the book, probably if you've read it or if you've read any reviews of it, you know what happens, but something happens in the book that makes the narrator sort of like not go a little bit like nuts, but she needs to research Felix himself. And he's been so sort of scrupulous about like maintaining his weird online identities that she like can't find anything about him, even though she feels like she should be able to, because it's ostensibly all of his stuff is taking place online, but like there's barely any reference to his account, which seems quite popular, like on any sort of message board or anything. And I was really interested in like how you would avoid this kind of like someone who's doing this kind of research, right? Like how you could avoid it. And the thing that I came up with is like basically you just do, because I think so many people have this certainty about getting information from the internet that you can just not, if you don't put it there, then they probably won't even think about you, which is sort of powerful.
I'm just going to be sort of like a putting machine here. Mm-hmm. Early in the novel, there's a reference to Ben Lerner's leaving the Atocha station. Is it true that you hate Ben Lerner? Just kidding.
Oh my God.
It seems to have similarities in plot and theme. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that and other literary works that are referenced throughout the novel, and to what extent you assume the reader would be familiar with those works, and what was your intention with bringing them in?
To what extent? I mean, I thought the same thing that I thought really like about any reference, which is that if you don't know, you can look it up, or if you don't want to look it up, that's fine, right? I think that most references, literary references, and maybe this is colored by having studied a lot of poetry in college, weirdly, like, and having to have all of the references introduced to me, I have this like freewheeling attitude, which is that like, if you don't get it, you can look it up. And if you don't want to look it up, it may or may not matter, right? And I think Ben Lerner, the reference to Ben Lerner, it's just a sort of throwaway line, or the narrator is surprised that this like ditzy girl who's a study abroad student in Spain is like referring to leaving the Atocha station. And she's like, oh, that's weird, because she doesn't seem like the kind of person who would read that sort of intellectual book. And what I wanted to do with those references is to like incorporate them in a way that is natural, like within the realist novel. So not have the narrator necessarily like discourse on them. I think they're often in autofiction, in Ben Lerner in particular, but also in other books. There will be just like like an essay sort of like grafted in there. And I always like that, but I wanted it to be more sort of naturalistic. So you have characters who are like talking about a book that they've just read. At one point, one of the narrator's friends tells her that her life reminds her of a new book that she just read, and it's a separation by Katie Kitamura, so you might recognize it, but if not, it just sounds like a plot description that someone is telling their friend. At one point, the narrator is like looking at Twitter, and there's a review of The Idiot by Elif Batuman, which has just come out. So I wanted it to be like the references work the way that references do in life. And I think that if you're depicting this milieu and this time, then you have to have lots of references, because people are constantly referring to things. Like our reference base is like theoretically like huge because we have the internet, right? So just as you can like look it up if you don't know what it is, like you might have a bunch of like things that you know about. And Anna also has a very like little bit in an Uncanny Valley that I thought was really smart when I read it, which is that you read a lot of books now and they feel very curated, and you can basically like sense the author having Googled things, right? And I wanted to like incorporate that somehow without making it seem like I have been Googling things to put in my book, if that makes sense.
I Googled a lot of things for my book.
Wow.
I think it's evident. So, I mean, but I like what you're saying about the, like no one is sitting at their kitchen table having finished a book and writing a review in their head. They're going on Twitter to see what other people said about it. Like the way that conversations happen is much more distributed and not always coherent in a lot of ways.
Right.
I'm just looking at the time. Are any of these, you can see these questions, right? Are any of them?
I haven't even looked at them. So I always,
sorry, you gave me control and I'm.
Oh yeah, and I was like, take control.
We've
done those too.
An interesting one that I would also be curious about. There have been several recent books that use Trump's inauguration as a jumping off point or have it ominously hanging in the background. Crudo by Olivia Lang is one, Jenny Offal's Weather is another. Why did you decide to set yours against Trump's inauguration? And do you have any thoughts on this as a trend in recent literature?
I think that first of all, it's like a sexy challenge, right? Because people are like, Trump is too absurd for fiction. And I think that there's a certain kind of person who's like, not for me. And I'm that kind of person. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons. But also, I think that I was interested in like this, it's not quite nihilism, but there's this like attitude of people it's particularly at the beginning, actually all throughout the Trump administration, where there was this simultaneous like YOLO, like I'm doing whatever I want attitude, coupled with this like severe political like moralizing that I was really interested in. So everything you were doing was vitally important, and everything you did had to have some sort of connection to like political activism, but also in your free time you were like being horrific because you were like, well, the world is about to end. And there was this real like attitude. I mean, we still sort of have it. I think we're right now in a low period of hysteria because of the coronavirus has like made everybody so tired of feeling like their lives were over. But for most, the last 5 years, I think there's been this like really hysterical, like the world is ending and what does that create in us attitude. So I think that is very interesting. And then I just also think like writers reach for whatever is around them often, right? I think it's the writer who picks a random historical topic and researches it and then spends 7 years writing a novel that is accurate and also sort of speaks truth to universal human themes is actually quite rare. And the writers that I like at least wrote more or less within their time. And I think that it's nice to be able to like pull details from whatever's around you.
What was something that Ben Lerner's, the jacket copy on Ben Lerner's most recent novel was like a prehistory of the present, something like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Which is an incredible phrase, but I understand exactly what that means, and the appeal of sort of writing historical fiction about your own moment.
Right, and you have this like horrific retrospective attitude where you're like I don't know if that's the most healthy thing to do with with historical thinking. I have to say, like, I don't know that recasting history and through the lens of the present is like super useful, but sometimes,
Well, depends how you do it and to what ends, like anything.
Yeah.
All right, I think that we are running up against the limit of like socially acceptable Zoom events, but and I'm feeling bad because there's some really great questions in this Q&A. Now
that I look at them, I can look at
Erica. Are we doing okay? Can we take another question if you're still there?
Yeah, you can go for another 5 minutes if you want.
Okay, thank you. Lauren, is there any one of these that you are excited to talk about, or something maybe we didn't talk about?
Let's see. Let's see. I'm not looking at the critical ones. I think the one, do we need literary criticism of novels, memoirs, born of the web? And does the novel resist feeling like the internet, or is it headed in that direction? Okay, so in light of this conversation about the Clubhouse novel or Twitter novel, do we need literary criticism of novels / memoirs born of the web? I think, for example, Mark McGurl's piece in Public Books, in this regard, feeling like the internet, does the novel resist feeling like the internet, or is it headed in that direction? I particularly wanted the novel to not feel like you're on the internet. And then all of these people said that because it was entertaining, it was like Twitter. So I don't know. I sort of think that the metaphors that we use, or the sort of like way we talk about things, like are always going to be like what's at hand, as I just said. So if you've written a novel about the internet, the ways that people talk about it, they will use like internet metaphors, and they will understand it through that lens, which can be interesting, but also can be sort of like limiting. But I wanted my book to feel like a novel. Like, I very much was like, I like novels. I like a long paragraph. I like long sentences that you have to like think about what they mean. And I wanted it to have a beginning, middle, end. I wanted there to be characters. The idea of whether there's character development is questionable, debatable, but yeah. So I really wanted it to like resist feeling like the internet, because I think that the internet is its own form and its own thing. And if you want something that works on the internet, then there's no reason not, I think trying to make the novel change the novel to fit the internet is a sort of losing battle, and you have to like, work with your strengths, basically.
Can I present a counter argument?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of Dana Spiotta's Innocents and Others, and the section she has.
Okay.
You haven't read this?
No, I haven't read it.
Oh man, I don't know why I'm so surprised. I
have it at my house.
You have not. Well, there's a section where it is the comments section of a website of a blog. I think it is, or maybe it's I can't remember now. Maybe it's a news site, and it's so perfectly done. It's brilliant. It's not the whole book. And it really makes an argument for the integration of these like literary forms, of these digital sort of formats that people write into. Like if you read the comment section on the New York Times cooking site, it's just like
an incredible document.
but I feel like it can be done in this very literal way. It can be done very badly. But in Leaving the Atocha Station, there's the GChat conversation. Even Jennifer Egan, A Visit from the Goon Squad, there's the famous PowerPoint chapter. And I think there's something about, I mean, that's obviously like playing with people's relationship to those forms as they exist online, and to their familiarity in the same way that like an epistolary novel would play with those conventions too. But I think that like a little bit of that creeping in can actually be done beautifully. Which is not to
Yeah.
say though, like you don't want to read a novel that reads like a PowerPoint presentation, because then you're just reading like Tim Ferriss. You know what I mean? Like you don't actually want it to infuse the whole book. But I guess I'm making a pro internet creep argument.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a difference between like using it and like putting it in there and like doing the whole, the whole book mimics the internet, right? Like I think when I have the narrator like relaying emails or relaying chats, there are very few, there's a couple of times where she's like, there's a G chat that's formatted like a G chat, but most of the time she's like recasting someone's emails in her own voice. And I think that's partially to do with like wanting her to be in total control of the narrative, and you don't know how much to trust her, but you have to because she's like in charge. And partially to do with like, often when people just transpose an email, I don't think it works, right? Like unless you get like unless you do it really well, which I assume I will trust you that Dana Spiotta does it really well in this book, like it doesn't work. And for this, I didn't want to make I didn't want to have it. I don't like it. I don't want it in there.
No, and you're smart to distinguish between like a device and something reading like the internet, like a book feeling like scrolling, which is very different than someone playing with that form intentionally.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, at the end of the day, it's like I wanted to make the novel like it's something that I liked, and it was like a novel-esque novel, right? Like it wasn't like Twitter.
Right. Well, and it would also be, I mean, this is sort of what I was saying earlier about the book is reviewed by literary critics. It's reviewed by reviewers, and the profession is one that, and requires a lot of people to be online, especially as reviewing becomes a more more reliant on freelancers, and there's like a whole economy behind that. But I can see it potentially reading differently to someone who is both a peer to you and also on the internet a lot, rather than someone like if I gave this to one of my college friends who isn't on Twitter all the time and like is a lawyer, it would read very differently.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think, is there anything else that you want to touch on? This has been really, really interesting and fun. And I hope, I guess I want to ask maybe one last question, because we are technically in San Francisco at Green Apple Books, the best bookstore in San Francisco. Is there anything that you, other than your book, I think Green Apple has signed copies of Fake Accounts. Is there anything that you've been reading that you want to encourage people to read, or something that might be like a good supplementary book for Fake Accounts?
I mean, the obvious supplementary book for Fake Accounts is your book and Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This. Those are the really obvious, like glaring supplementary texts. In terms of like
a Lauren Oyler deep cut, maybe.
Oh no, a deep cut. I don't know. The author that I really like is Iris Murdoch. That is the one that I'll always recommend her. And then I'm looking at my Iris Murdoch. What's a good one? I like Under the Net, which is great.
Great.
Sorry.
No, thank you.
I wasn't ready to.
No, I know. It's always the worst question where you're like, have I ever read a book? There's some over there.
Probably not.
Have I read Dana Spiotta? But should I mispronounce her name? Lauren, thank you. This was a pleasure. And
thanks so much for having me.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you,
Lauren and Anna. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We do have signed copies of Fake Accounts. You can also get them. Let me show you the autograph. There you go.
I did it.
You can also get them on our website at greenapplebooks.com. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.